What's coming up?
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hopes that Russia will not reject a 30-day Washington-backed ceasefire proposal to end its war with Ukraine. The U.S. says China is the biggest threat to its national security, and it must stay ahead of the Asian power to remain the world's most lethal fighting force. And the West African nation of Liberia receives firefighting equipment from the eastern U.S. state of Maryland. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says it will be, quote, highly unfortunate if Russia rejects a 30-day Washington-backed ceasefire proposal in its war with Ukraine. Rubio was talking to reporters in Ireland a day after U.S. and Ukrainian officials agreed in Saudi Arabia on a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. Rubio says that the U.S. is taking the offer to Russia and that the ball is now in Moscow's court.
And we'll see what their response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear.
After the ceasefire talks in Saudi Arabia, the U.S. lifted its suspension of military aid and intelligence sharing for Ukraine, and Kyiv signaled it was open to a ceasefire in the war with Russia. The U.S. administration's efforts to end Russia's war in Ukraine is putting pressure on the Kremlin. But Moscow has made considerable territorial gains, and some in Russia say they're prepared to give up nothing. VOA's Jeff Custer narrates this report from our team in Moscow.
Moscow this week suffered the biggest Ukrainian drone attack since the start of the war, leaving at least 3 dead and 17 injured. Many Muscovites are trying to ignore the war, but many also hope that negotiations between the Kremlin and the new U.S. administration will soon bring a peace that Russians consider a victory. Officials say the goal is international recognition of the new borders that the Russian army has obtained by force.
It is clear that there will be a bilateral settlement between us and Kyiv. It should be a peace treaty that will legalize the new borders of Russia and the post-Soviet borders of Ukraine.
Many in Moscow are already celebrating the new geopolitical scenario before the conflict is ended.
This is a real victory. You can open champagne. Also, it cannot be lost. Russia must continue the offensive because no one canceled the ambitions of the United States. Yes, they are afraid of us, but it does not mean that they abandoned their idea of a world empire.
After more than 3 years of war, independent media outlet Mediazona counts more than 95,000 Russian casualties. But these losses are not stopping the Kremlin from carrying on with the war. In a meeting with wives and mothers of deceased soldiers, Russian President Vladimir Putin said there would be no concessions.
We are not going to do that. We must choose for ourselves a version of the world that would suit us and that would ensure peace for our country for a long historical perspective.
Critics of Putin can only speak from exile. As they see it, the Kremlin could make concessions, but giving up its territorial ambitions is out of the question.
Compromises can be presented on some other issues related to how the Ukrainian security architecture will be formed after the war. Moscow wants to be a participant in the formation of this new Ukrainian security architecture, and in fact, to describe what can be done and what cannot be done.
Russian officials are looking forward to a meeting with U.S. officials following the talks between U.S. and Ukrainian negotiating teams in Saudi Arabia. So far, there is no such gathering in sight. Jeff Custer, VOA News.
The U.S. says China is the biggest threat to national security, the pacing challenge that America's military must stay ahead of to remain the world's most lethal fighting force. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Bob has the details.
The U.S. Navy, 296 ships strong. Thousands of companies build the parts and maintain them, including Fairbanks Morse Defense, the largest engine manufacturer in North and South America.
This engine has about 10,000 horsepower.
CEO George Whittier tells VOA 90% of the company's business goes to the U.S. Navy or Coast Guard. The company, he said, expected the size of the Navy fleet to increase to match Navy force structure goals that get bigger every year. But in recent years, the fleet decreased. Last year's budget funded just 6 new Navy ships, while decommissioning 15 from the fleet.
And then for the 2025 budget plan, originally that was supposed to be 10 new ships, and now they're only going to asking for 6 new ships again, and they want to decommission 19. So that's then down minus 13.
While the U.S. Navy is still considered the most powerful in the world when it comes to firepower and tonnage, the number of U.S. Navy ships is falling behind China's. Its Navy is on pace this year to surpass 400 ships, according to the Pentagon.
It's very frustrating and very challenging to be a supplier. They're rapidly growing the size of their Navy, and here we are on the sidelines. It's, we need to get more ships that are out there.
We send a shipbuilding plan to Congress every year.
Admiral Jim Kilby, the acting chief of naval operations, agrees.
And we've advocated for a bigger Navy for a long time.
But he says he hasn't had the budget to replace all his aging ships and submarines, much less grow the force.
And when we get a new ship, we'll replace an old ship because that old ship is more expensive and harder to maintain.
Whittier says the lack of growth isn't just slowing the maritime defense industry, it's sinking the supply chain.
There's thousands and thousands of suppliers that have gone out of business, and it's a real risk. I got a note from the folks at Electric Boat that make the submarines, and they'd identified something like 350 critical suppliers where they were concerned if they go out of business that they don't necessarily have a backup.
Fairbanks Morse Defense happens to be one of the biggest suppliers to U.S. submarines and the sole U.S. company supplying the biggest engines used in the military's amphibious warfare ships.
Without 4 of these, an amphib is nothing but a piece of metal floating in the water.
Each engine about the size of a small school bus.
We should have 2 engine suppliers, but the reality is if the Navy's only going to build 6 ships a year, it's a struggle to keep 1 engine supplier in business, let alone 2.
A problem so concerning, the president is taking action, announcing this month a new office in the White House devoted entirely to shipbuilding.
We used to make so many ships. We don't make them anymore very much, but we're going to make them very fast, very soon.
Congress is expected to increase the military's budget to surge resources for its shipbuilding shortfalls. While most ships made in the United States are for its military, Senator Mark Kelly tells VOA the state of U.S. commercial shipping is even more dire.
We went from 10,000 ships during World War II to 85 today. So in case of an emergency, in case of a conflict with a near-peer adversary, we're quite limited to getting all those supplies and equipment, troops across the ocean.
The United States builds about 5 commercial ships each year. China builds more than 1,000.
They have one shipyard, just one shipyard, that's bigger than all of our shipyards put together. They can construct them very, very quickly. And we just don't do that anymore.
Kelly in December introduced bipartisan legislation called the Ships for America Act. The bill aims to increase the U.S. commercial fleet by 250 ships in 10 years, which will also increase the supply chain for military ships.
A lot of the parts that go into a U.S. aircraft carrier, some of those same parts for those systems go in merchant ships.
Kelly says the bill uses tax incentives and fees on cargo coming into the country to fund the growth.
There are provisions in the legislation to have it fully paid for, so we don't have to add anything to the annual deficit.
Defense industry leaders say they welcome efforts to prioritize shipbuilding to help counter China, and warn inaction will put the U.S. even further behind in the future. The Navy's latest shipbuilding plan only increases its fleet to 380 ships by 2040, still fewer than the number of Chinese naval vessels today. Carla Babb, VOA News, Norfolk, Virginia.
There is increased Chinese presence in Africa, where over 25% of African ports are now run by Chinese state-owned firms. According to research carried out by the Africa Center for Strategic and International Studies, Chinese firms are now active stakeholders in an estimated 78 ports across 32 African countries. For more perspective, I'm joined from here in Washington by Paul Nantulia, a research specialist at the Africa Center for Strategic and International Studies. Paul, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you very much, Esther. Always nice to be here.
Now tell us what's driving Chinese firms to run African ports.
Well, one, China is a trading nation. Trade is in China's DNA. And so, building export capacity, building the capacity to get imports into China has been a #1 strategic issue ever since the reform and opening up of the 1990s. And so what the Chinese government has done is, they had this go-out strategy under President Jiang Zemin that provided massive state subsidies for state-owned firms, shippers and shipping fleets to go out and capture new markets, especially in the developing world. And so it became profitable for Chinese state-owned firms to strike deals with African countries. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why, they are racing very quickly to be in a very dominant position when it comes to Africa's export infrastructure.
But Paul, the question most Africans would be asking is, what are they getting out of this?
Well, #1, they're getting efficiency, right? Because after privatization, efficiency has become a major buzzword in Africa as far as export infrastructure is concerned. So that's the first thing they're getting. The second thing they're getting is finance. Because you see, the Chinese involvement in the African port space is in terms of building, it's in terms of renovating, it's in terms of finance, that is loan finance, and it's also in terms of operations. So it's the entire port development chain. So African countries are able to obtain finance. Then they're also able to increase their export volumes into China. So for instance, last year, one of the major shippers, which is actually the largest shipper in the world today, COSCO, which is Chinese state-owned, reduced the travel time of goods and services from East and Southern Africa into China mm-hmm. To 20 days, right? And that obviously stimulates a lot of economic development for the African continent.
Well, Paul, some people would be a little bit concerned here from the continent, asking what are these naval activities really, what are they here for? Do you think there could be an element of some sort of spying on these ports or these countries that they are, spread around?
Well, our study found, and this, by the way, is the second study. We did another one in 2022 that was basically looking at China's naval presence on the continent. What our study finds is that some, not all, but some of these maritime hubs that Chinese firms are involved with on the African continent do have design specifications that allow them, #1, to dock Chinese naval assets for military exercises and things of that nature. But then some of them also are able to berth major Chinese combatants. And so what the data is saying is that when it comes to the indicators for the potential viability of some of these ports for Chinese naval use, one of the most important indicators is the design features. So if a port is designed to be able to berth major Chinese combatants, that obviously becomes one of the data points that Chinese shippers and Chinese naval planners look at. So yes, some, not all, but some of these African ports do meet some of those specifications.
Paul, thank you very much. Excellent insight there. Paul Nantulia is a research specialist at the Africa Center for Strategic and International Studies. Israeli hostages recently released from Gaza, speaking out about the difficult conditions they were forced to endure during 16 months of captivity by the U.S.-designated terror group Hamas. Linda Gradstein reports from Jerusalem.
Eli Sharabi was taken hostage from Kibbutz Be'eri near the border with Gaza on October 7, 2023. His brother, also taken hostage, was killed in captivity. Until he was released a month ago, Sharabi didn't know that his wife and 2 daughters were killed in their home by members of Hamas. Sharabi described being tortured in a recent interview on Israeli TV.
I remember not being able to fall asleep because of the pain. The ropes are already digging into your flesh, and every movement makes you want to scream. And there are moments you just pass out. You pass out, lose consciousness. You wake up after 2 or 3 hours and the pain continues.
Sharabi was held captive for almost 500 days, mostly in underground tunnels. He survived on a few hundred calories a day, losing 40% of his body weight. The emaciated condition of Sharabi and of the other 2 hostages released with him have shocked and angered Israelis.
You don't care about the beatings you get, and they beat you. They break my ribs. I don't care. The hunger. Give me the half a pita.
Hamas is holding the remains of 35 hostages who were killed in captivity and another 24 believed to still be alive. Their families say time is running out to save them.
Recently, released hostages reported that Alon has been confined in a small, dark tunnel, 40 meters underground, for over 500 days. He's constantly chained at the ankles, subject to beatings and starvation, and has lost significant weight. He has shrapnels in one eye, leaving him blind, and there is a severe concern that he will lose his sight in the other eye as well.
After U.S. President Donald Trump saw the TV interview with Sharabi, he invited a group of released hostages to the White House and issued a sharp ultimatum to Hamas. Some former hostages, like Keith Siegel, a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen, believe that President Trump is the best hope for freedom for the remaining hostages. Soon after his release, Siegel visited his destroyed home in Kibbutz Kfar Aza and recorded a video thanking President Trump.
I wanted to say to you once again how urgent it is to get all of the hostages out of Gaza and back home to their families. You have done so much so far, and we all urge you to continue your efforts and use your ability to allow more progress in the hostage exchange deals.
Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff is in Qatar trying to arrange a continuation of the current ceasefire between Israel and Hamas while talks continue toward a more permanent deal and more hostage releases. Linda Gradstein, VOA News, Jerusalem.
Still to come, a U.S. fire station donates firefighting gear to West African country of Liberia. We'll be right back.
Sex workers are usually adults who receive money or goods in exchange for consensual sexual services. So if labor rights exist to protect workers, should sex workers be included? On the next edition of Our Voices, we'll explore the issue of sex worker rights, the impact of criminalization, and why some are calling for decriminalizing of sex work. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, a Zimbabwean High Court judge has adjourned the case of journalist Blaster Mlanga, who was arrested over his interviews with a war veteran turned politician who criticized President Emerson Mnangagwa. Mlanga, a journalist with Newsday and Heart and Soul Television, has been in custody since February 24th over accusations of incitement. Somali officials say security forces have ended a 24-hour siege at the Cairo hotel in the central city of Beledweyne. All 6 attackers who laid siege to the hotel were killed, according to officials. Al-Shabaab, a U.S.-designated terrorist group, is claiming responsibility for Tuesday's attack. The attack began when a car bomb exploded at the hotel that houses traditional elders and military officers. And senior European Union officials, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, are in South Africa Thursday for a meeting with President Cyril Ramaphosa that centers on bolstering trade and diplomatic ties. South Africa is hoping to make progress on help for poor countries, especially on debt relief. In Prince George's County, Maryland, Fire Station 802 in Capitol Heights is making an impact far beyond its local community. The station is donating essential firefighting gear and equipment to the West African nation of Liberia, a country in urgent need of resources to battle fires. VOA's Jackson Vungani has more.
Inside Fire Station 802, a team of Liberian American community leaders are gathered on an early morning to receive the donation. Many have been living in this neighborhood for decades. Today's effort was led by Councilwoman Wala Blege, a Liberian American community leader dedicated to strengthening ties between her homeland and Prince George's County.
Well, honestly, when the vice president's team came here, one of the first things that they told us is that they are in need of equipment, fire trucks, fire equipment, all types, all things fire. And when I reached out to our chief Tiffany Green, she immediately responded that they had already had a package that could be donated. It really touched my heart because when we see in the shutdown of USAID, other programs that are being cut during the time of this federal government, we can be the actual outreach to help our communities. Some helmets here, quite a few helmets that have been used, and then we have some boots that we're donating here, and these actually look really good. And then we have the gear, the fire suppression gear.
For Fire Chief Tiffany Green, the donation reflects the station's commitment to both its local and international cousins.
So today, Prince George's County Fire and EMS Department has the opportunity to donate over 40 sets of personal protective equipment. We serve our community here locally, and to be able to serve our international community is even more important for us. Firefighters go into burning buildings every single day. They risk their lives. They're heroes, right? But they need the protection and the gear that allows them to do their job. We understand here we are afforded with the opportunity to have this gear on a regular basis, but some of our partners like Liberia, again, don't have that ability. So us having the opportunity to gift them this gear, over $150,000 worth of gear, is important for us. It serves our mission of service, and it warms our heart. So this is one of our newer fire stations, about 3.5 years old. This fire station, again, hosts about 6 personnel daily. It has a ladder truck, as you can see right here, an engine and an ambulance, and we serve this entire community off of Central Avenue in Capitol Heights.
Isaac Year, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Liberia to the United States, received the equipment on behalf of the Liberian government. He says that the donation will help fill a critical gap for Liberian firefighters.
The initial donation from PG County was going to go a long way in helping the firefighters to get protected, to be able to fight fire. And we'd like to appreciate them for doing this. They have been our partners, so this donation goes a long way, in sort of helping us to help the firefighters to be able to fight fire in a small way.
A former professor and lawyer, Wala Blege was elected to the Prince George's County Council in 2022 to represent District 6, home to a large population of Liberian Americans.
We do have some fire trucks we can donate. They were going to go somewhere else, but it didn't work out. So we're going to try to see if we can get it to Liberia. That's a longer process, but we're looking at that also because we're filling in a need, and a need that is great and saves lives. That's the most important part about it.
Legge says that the state of Maryland has an excellent relationship with Liberia, and this type of donation means so much to the people of the West African nation. Jackson Vungani, VOA News, Washington.
An innovative solution to remotely power devices using natural biological processes could help farmers get the most from their fields. VOA's Ken Faribault explains.
One of the biggest challenges for Mount Pulaski, Illinois farmer Tom Martin is understanding the quality of the soil in the fields where his corn and soybeans grow.
It's one of the basics of our profitability, be able to know what's in our soils to be able to grow our crops. Testing in the past, for me, has been unreliable.
That information influences how much fertilizer Martin might need to buy. But using technology to gather data deep in the middle of his fields, far away from sources of electricity and underneath growing crops blocking the sun's solar energy, Martin's biggest obstacle in analyzing the soil is powering devices that gather information.
I look and see that if there's other new technology to help us do a better job at understanding what's going on in our soils.
I knew that there was a need for more cheap and accessible and easy to use, basically, agricultural soil health sensors.
Laura Jalliffe is a postgraduate research student at Northwestern University. She's been working on a device that doesn't need a battery and works almost anywhere, in any condition, day or night.
It's meant to address the challenge of soil health sensing in agriculture.
The microbial fuel cell Jalliffe works with is the creation of Northwestern University student Bill Yen.
So all we're doing is we're putting a device there that can grab all these electrons that these microbes release, and then we're using that to channel into our electronic devices to create our source of power.
Researchers first discovered microbes could naturally produce electricity as early as 1911. But only recent advances, like the soil sensors Yen and Jalliffe developed, are beginning to show the technology is viable.
The overall motivation for this is really to push intelligence beyond the grid.
Yen says the microbial fuel cell powers sensors that supply information to artificial intelligence, which helps provide a better understanding of the overall environment. Yen's device is adapted for different soil conditions to get maximum use. The technology is simple to create, open source, and can be constructed using a 3D printer.
All it is an anode and a cathode. So we have two pieces of electrode that we made out of carbon felt. So these can be things that you can make from really plant matter. So you can make carbon felt anywhere in the world just by processing biomass.
Harnessing the natural power of microbes doesn't produce enough electricity to power cell phones or personal devices. It only creates about 200 microwatts of energy. Making them bigger also doesn't create more power.
You can't just make it twice as big, expect to get twice the amount of power.
But it's just enough to give farmer Tom Martin information that could save him a significant amount of money when it's time to apply fertilizer to his fields.
And it's not just a fertilizer, it's everything, fuel, labor.
With the information the microbial fuel cell can provide, Martin isn't just helping his finances by reducing fertilizer use, he's also helping the environment. Kane Fairbaugh, VOA News, Mount Pulaski, Illinois.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.